Right, listen here. Pay $1,300 one time to own Adobe Photoshop entirely, or pay $59.99 per month for 5 years. And own nothing? The stupid, clever executives playing mind games with us have developed a secret weapon. They've realized $1,300 is way too much for a service that edits photos, but $60 per month feels reasonable. And who wants Photoshop for just 5 years? So how about $60 for 10 years? Or 20 years? Let's account for inflation. In 10 years, instead of $60 per month, they will for sure have increased the price to more than $100 per month. And the result? Look at Adobe's maddening stock explosion. Most companies spend decades trying to win customers over. Adobe? They figured out how to trap them in a never-ending loop of monthly payments, and then had the audacity to convince us it was for our own good. These are the same people who gave the world the wonderful Photoshop software, a tool so powerful it can remove your ex from a wedding photo like they never existed. Then one day, instead of selling us the software, Adobe woke up and thought, you know what, let's just rent it to them forever. And here's the truly diabolical bit. It worked. They turned creative software into the digital equivalent of a mortgage. Miss a payment? You lose access to the very files you created. Cancel your subscription. Good luck opening that project from last year. The software you once owned is now a monthly bill that sits smugly between your Netflix and your electricity. And while creatives raged on forums and social media, Adobe's revenue shot through the roof. Their profit margins made oil companies look humble.
No, we had this hypothesis, we had good assertions, we had good data, clearly we hadn't connected the dots, so we were going to make that investment. If that investment paid out, we would double down. If the investment did not pay down, and that's how we think about the company even now. I mean, we have to change, we have to evolve, we have to make investments.
And now, they're doubling down, jacking up prices, killing off cheaper plans, and shoving AI tools you didn't ask for into every product before charging extra for them. This isn't just a story about one company's business model. It's the story of how Adobe quietly rewired the creative world's entire economy, all while smiling politely and assuring you it was for your convenience, old chap. Before we dive further, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and notification bell. I have plenty more business documentaries to share, because these wild stories never seem to ease up. Every single day, you're surrounded by Adobe's work, even if you've never clicked install on a single one of their programs. That eye-catching billboard you saw on your commute, designed in Adobe Illustrator. The trailer for your favorite streaming series, cut in Adobe Premiere Pro. Adobe's fingerprints are on so much of what you see that you stop noticing it. And that's the cleverest part. They've become the invisible infrastructure of modern creativity. If it looks polished, professional, or persuasive, odds are it passed through their software at some stage. And here's where it gets personal. If you've ever tried to build a business, grow a YouTube channel, or just make something look presentable enough to share, you felt the pull. Maybe you wanted a logo that didn't scream, made in word art. Maybe you wanted your holiday video to look like an actual film instead of a stitched-together slideshow. Almost every path to looking professional leads to an Adobe login screen. That's not luck, that's design. Adobe didn't just sell tools, they turned themselves into the tools. They trained employers to expect Adobe Experience on a CV. They trained clients to demand Photoshop and Illustrator files so they wouldn't run into compatibility nightmares. And that's where the brilliance lies. They didn't just compete on features, they rewired the very standards by which professional work gets judged. Even if you hate Adobe, even if you'd rather not pay them another penny, you still need them. Because if you walk away, you're not just losing software, you're losing the ability to collaborate, to deliver, to even be taken seriously. Think about what that means. By the time Adobe flipped the switch to subscriptions in 2013, they had already won the only battle that mattered: entrenchment. It wasn't about whether their software was the best. It was about the fact that their software was the language everyone else spoke. You can leave, sure, but you'll be the one speaking Esperanto, while the rest of the industry keeps talking in Photoshop. Adobe didn't have to twist your arm or force you into a subscription. They just built a world where the path out is so painful, so costly in time, money, and lost opportunity that most people don't even try. Staying is easier. Paying is easier. Month after month, year after year. And it's bloody exhausting to admit it. That's how Adobe wins. Not by brute force, but by clever design. By making their bridge the only one across the river, then charging you rent every time you cross.
We moved to the cloud, we were incredibly surprised by how people were fundamentally wanting to do the right thing,
And it
for
also
the
got
value
cheaper.
that we're getting. And it got cheaper.
2013 wasn't just another product launch year for Adobe. It was the year they set fire to their old business model and walked away without looking back. No warning shots, no gentle transition, no, we'll see how it goes. They took a business that had been selling boxed software for decades and said, from now on, you rent. To understand why, you have to look at what was happening behind the curtain. The Creative Suite model, those $1,300 upfront purchases, had a problem from Adobe's perspective. It was cyclical. Big sales came when a new version launched, but in between, the revenue line dipped. Customers could skip upgrades and keep using older versions for years, which meant Adobe was constantly hustling to justify the next release. They were also fighting piracy. Back then, cracked copies of Photoshop or Illustrator were everywhere. If you were a broke student, a freelancer just starting out, or someone curious about design, odds are you knew at least one person with a friend who could set you up with an unofficial copy. Adobe's boxed model made that possible because once the software was out in the world, control was gone. A subscription model solved both problems in one move. With Creative Cloud, there was no disk to copy, no installer to pass around. The programs lived behind an Adobe account login. You stopped paying, access vanished. You wanted the latest version, you had it automatically the day it launched. And for Adobe, that meant something beautiful in the eyes of investors. Recurring, predictable revenue that grew every month without the exhausting peaks and valleys of the old cycle. But the way they rolled it out was brutal. They didn't just introduce Creative Cloud alongside Creative Suite. They killed the perpetual license entirely. No more. I'll stick with CS6, thanks. No safety net. If you wanted to keep working in the Adobe ecosystem after 2013, you signed up for the subscription. Or you left, and people were furious. Designers who'd spent decades buying Adobe products suddenly felt trapped. Photographers who only used Photoshop resented paying for a full suite of apps they'd never touch. Video editors grumbled about paying year after year for features they didn't need. Forums filled with angry threads titled, "Adobe is holding my files hostage," and "I'm done with Creative Cloud." But for the first few months, it looked like this might actually backfire. Alternative software companies seized the moment. Serif pushed Affinity Photo, CorelDRAW made a comeback pitch, and open source advocates tried to lure people to GIMP or INKSCAPE. On paper, there were plenty of other options. Although critics missed this, Adobe didn't need to win the argument. They just needed people to keep working. And the reality was, switching wasn't simple. Clients expected .psd and .ai files. Agencies had workflows built entirely around Creative Suite. Universities taught Adobe shortcuts and menus, not competitors' tools. Even if someone wanted to leave, the cost, in time, money, and lost compatibility, was often too high. And while everyone was busy debating the morality of the move, Adobe was doing something far more important, quietly adding value to Creative Cloud in ways that made the old model look static. Suddenly, your subscription included cloud storage, integrated font libraries, and constant feature updates. You no longer waited 18 months for a new version. New tools just appeared in the apps you were already using. Oddly enough, this diabolical plan was turning out to be like Costco's membership subscription. They were improving the customer experience rapidly and increasing the value so rapidly that it seemed to make the subscription worth it, at least on paper. Though some of us would still rather have kept our box and CDROMs, thank you very much. There was also a psychological shift happening. In the boxed era, Adobe had to justify a massive price tag all at once. In the subscription era, they just had to make $50 or $60 a month feel reasonable. Once people got used to it hitting their credit card automatically, resistance faded. That's the trick. Recurring costs don't feel like big purchases. They feel like utilities, part of the background noise of your expenses. By the end of that first year, the panic was over. Not because Adobe had made peace with its customers, but because most of those customers had simply adapted. The boycott talk died down. The competitors faded back into niche markets, and Adobe's subscriber numbers kept climbing, quarter after quarter. Wall Street noticed. Predictable revenue streams are like catnip to investors, and Adobe had just given them the perfect specimen. The stock chart started a climb that would run for the next decade, with barely a pause. By proving they could not only survive the switch, but thrive, Adobe became the poster child for the software as a service model. Other companies took notes. Microsoft, Autodesk, and even small niche software makers began shifting to subscriptions, citing Adobe as proof it could be done. Industries far outside tech, from car makers to gym equipment companies, started wondering how they could charge monthly for things they used to sell outright. But the real win for Adobe wasn't just financial. It was strategic. They'd reshaped the relationship between themselves and their customers. Under the old model, Adobe worked for you. They had to keep impressing you to convince you to buy the next version. Under the subscription model, you work for Adobe. You have to keep paying just to hold on to what you already have. And in 2013, that power shift was complete. When the outrage over subscriptions died down, Adobe didn't waste time basking in victory. One of their first moves was bundling. In the old days, you could buy Photoshop on its own, or Illustrator on its own, or Premiere on its own. Expensive, yes, but straightforward. If you only needed one tool, you bought one tool. Creative Cloud flipped that logic. Suddenly, the best value was in the All Apps plan. 40+ programs for a flat monthly fee. You probably only needed 2 or 3, but Adobe made it feel irrational not to get the bundle. It's the Costco trick. You walk in for milk, walk out with 5 gallons of mayonnaise, because it seemed like a deal. In Adobe's case, you signed up for Photoshop and Lightroom, but ended up paying for Animate, After Effects, Audition, Bridge, and a dozen other apps you'll never open. And once you're on the bundle, leaving becomes harder. Cancel, and you don't just lose Photoshop. You lose everything. Even if you weren't using it, you could have. That potential loss becomes psychological leverage. Another masterstroke, the so-called monthly plan that isn't really monthly at all. On Adobe's pricing page, you see $59.99 per month. Looks flexible, right? Wrong. That's an annual commitment billed monthly. Try to cancel halfway through, and Adobe slaps you with a penalty. 50% of your remaining contract. It's not a subscription, it's a leash. Most customers don't realize until they try to leave, at which point the choice is clear. Pay the fee or keep paying the subscription. Either way, Adobe gets your money. Then there's pricing itself. Adobe knows they can't double costs overnight without sparking a revolt. But add $1 here, $2 there, and people shrug and let the auto pay run. $59.99 becomes $62.99, then $64.99. Add a new feature, say AI-powered background removal, and that's another couple of dollars. On paper, it looks like minor inflation. Over millions of users, it's billions in new revenue. The slow boil works because Creative Cloud payments have been rebranded as a utility. You don't question your water bill every month, and Adobe wants Photoshop to feel the same. Essential. Background noise, not worth the hassle of reconsidering. And then there's the enterprise market, the real jackpot. While freelancers and small studios make noise online, Adobe quietly makes staggering sums from Fortune 500 contracts. These aren't $59.99 subscriptions. These are multi-year deals worth millions, covering hundreds or thousands of employees. Once a company standardizes on Adobe, changing is almost impossible. Every workflow, every template, every training module is built around their ecosystem. Switching vendors isn't just a software decision, it's a complete rebuild of the company's creative infrastructure. Nobody takes that risk. This is why Adobe's revenue is so predictable. Whole industries are welded to their products, and those contracts renew like clockwork. The most clever lock-in, though, isn't contractual, it's technical. A Photoshop PSD or an Illustrator AI file aren't just files, they're proprietary cages. Yes, alternatives like Affinity or GIMP can open them, but not perfectly. Layers shift, fonts break, complex layouts fall apart. That's intentional. Adobe doesn't just sell software, they own the creative world's file system. If you want 100% fidelity, you have to use Adobe. If your client demands the raw files, you'd better deliver them in Adobe's formats. It's lock-in disguised as industry standard, and it works. People notice they're the ones being squeezed. And Adobe's customers, from freelancers to Fortune 500 firms, have never been shy about venting their frustration. From the very beginning of Creative Cloud, the complaints piled up. Forums were filled with posts titled, "Adobe is holding my files hostage," or "Worst business model in history." Designers tweeted screenshots of cancellation pages that felt deliberately confusing. Photographers compared the subscription plan to attacks they couldn't avoid. But the grumbling wasn't just noise online. Regulators were listening. In 2024, Adobe was sued by the US Federal Trade Commission over deceptive subscription practices. The allegations weren't minor. The FTC argued Adobe buried cancellation fees in fine print, made it deliberately difficult to find out how much you'd be charged for leaving early, and used manipulative, dark patterns in the cancellation flow. According to the lawsuit, customers would try to quit and be confronted with screens that made it seem like they were keeping their files, or that quitting would mean immediate data loss, or that the penalty was unclear until the very last click. In other words, Adobe was accused of making escape feel so terrifying or confusing that people just gave up and stayed. Adobe eventually settled, agreeing to changes and fines, but the damage to their reputation was already done.
Now, a lot of this is based on generative AI. Now, bear in mind, it does take a lot of resources in order to generate some of these things, particularly generating videos. There's data centers, there's a lot of computing power that has to be paid for somehow.
Around the same time, Adobe faced another storm. Artificial intelligence. When generative AI tools started exploding in 2023 and 2024, Adobe was quick to integrate them into Photoshop and Premiere. They branded their system as Firefly and marketed it as safe, ethical, and trained only on licensed or public data. But a buried clause in Adobe's terms of service sparked outrage. Customers discovered language suggesting Adobe could use their own creative work to train its AI models. Artists, photographers, and designers erupted. The idea that the same company charging them $59.99 a month could also harvest their content to build AI tools that might compete with them felt like betrayal. Adobe backpedaled, clarifying and rewriting the terms, but the distrust lingered. Many creatives started openly wondering whether they were paying Adobe to replace them. Then came one of the boldest and most controversial moves yet. In May 2025, Adobe announced they were discontinuing the beloved All Apps plan. In its place came new tiers, Creative Cloud Pro, which included AI features and a small price increase, $59.99 per month for now, but with limits, and Creative Cloud Standard, a stripped-down version without AI tools. This wasn't just an update. It was a forced migration. Customers on the old plans were told they'd be shifted onto the new ones, whether they liked it or not. And because the Pro plan was positioned as the default for serious users, it felt like a price hike disguised as an upgrade. Reaction was swift and brutal. Hashtags like Cancel Adobe trended on X. Independent creators accused Adobe of nickel and diming them at the exact moment AI tools should have been included as part of the existing subscription. Critics compared it to selling you a car, then charging extra to use the steering wheel, the sort of nonsense you'd expect after a long night at the pub, not from a company worth billions. But Adobe didn't flinch. They knew that, outrage or not, most customers wouldn't leave. The lock-in was too strong, and then there's the lingering embarrassment of Figma. Back in 2022, Adobe announced it would buy the design startup for $20 billion, a staggering sum that signaled just how seriously they took the threat of competition. Figma's collaborative browser-based design platform had grown so popular with young designers that Adobe saw no safe path forward except acquiring it. But regulators in the US, EU, and UK smelled blood. They blocked the deal on antitrust grounds, arguing Adobe was trying to eliminate its most dangerous competitor. By 2023, Adobe had to walk away and pay $1 billion breakup fee for the privilege of trying. Worse still, Figma emerged from the failed acquisition stronger, flush with cash, and ready to IPO. The message to the industry was clear. Adobe wasn't invincible, and competitors could fight back. Here's the irony. For all the outrage, Adobe's subscriber numbers and revenues kept climbing. Freelancers might rant on social media, but they still needed Photoshop for client work. Agencies might complain about creeping costs, but ripping out Adobe from their workflows was unthinkable. That's the contradiction Adobe has mastered. The louder the backlash, the more it proves how essential they are. If people didn't depend on Adobe, they wouldn't care enough to be angry. It's a twisted kind of triumph. Adobe has become so entrenched that even when they're sued, dragged in the press, and slammed by their own users, the machine keeps printing money. And that raises the question, how long can a company push before dependence turns into open rebellion? Adobe has pulled off one of the most successful business pivots in corporate history. They went from a boxed software company, worried about piracy, to a subscription empire worth well over $100 billion. They reshaped how the entire creative industry works, and in the process, they convinced Wall Street that subscriptions weren't just a model, they were the model. But here's the thing about being the king. The higher you climb, the more people want to knock you down. And right now, Adobe is walking a very thin line between brilliance and backlash. Adobe's newest obsession is artificial intelligence. With products like Firefly, Photoshop's generative fill, and AI-powered video tools in Premiere, they're pitching themselves as the safe, enterprise-ready alternative to the Wild West of generative AI startups. But of course, safe doesn't mean free. These tools aren't simply being added to your subscription. They're monetized with credit systems. You get a limited number of AI uses each month, and if you go over, you pay extra. It's upselling on top of upselling. The subscription that was supposed to give you everything now comes with a meter running, and it raises a big question. How long will customers tolerate being charged rent for their tools and then charged again for the privilege of actually using them? Adobe is betting that professionals will grumble but pay. Because if the AI saves you hours of work, the math is hard to argue with. But if AI-native competitors like Midjourney, Runway, or Canva offer faster, cheaper, more fun tools, that's where Adobe could finally face a generational crack in their dominance. For the first time in years, Adobe isn't just looking behind them at pirates and hobbyists. They're looking sideways at serious challengers. Figma is stronger than ever. Canva, once dismissed as a toy for non-designers, has grown into a behemoth with over 100 million users. Its drag-and-drop simplicity appeals to a generation that doesn't care about mastering Photoshop shortcuts. And with AI integrations, Canva is starting to eat away at the casual and small business market Adobe used to ignore. The danger here isn't that professionals abandon Adobe overnight. It's that the next wave of creators grows up outside the Adobe ecosystem. If the industry standard slowly shifts, the entrenchment Adobe built so carefully could erode. On another front, governments are circling. Adobe already settled with the FTC over deceptive subscription practices. The EU and UK forced them to abandon the Figma acquisition on antitrust grounds. And regulators aren't done. Adobe's entire model, locking professionals into a single ecosystem with high switching costs, is exactly the kind of monopoly behavior that antitrust lawyers love to attack. If governments decide Adobe's practices are harmful to competition, we could see lawsuits, fines, or even forced changes to how they do business. The irony is that Adobe's greatest strength, the fact that they're indispensable, is also their biggest legal risk. And I can't help but think it's all gone a bit pear-shaped. And then there's the cultural shift. The generation that grew up on Photoshop sees Adobe as the gold standard. But Gen Z and Gen Alpha are growing up with different expectations: free tools, browser-based collaboration, and AI that does the heavy lifting. They don't want to memorize 300 keyboard shortcuts. They want results fast. If those creators build their careers on Canva, Figma, or AI-native platforms, Adobe's empire could face the same fate as Kodak. Dominant one decade, obsolete the next. So can the machine last forever? Maybe. Adobe is smart, ruthless, and deeply entrenched. They have the money, the talent, and the market share to keep squeezing for years to come. But history shows that every empire eventually meets a challenger it can't absorb, or a regulator it can't outmaneuver. Adobe's subscription pivot was not just brilliant, it was historic. It turned them into a Wall Street darling and made them richer than they ever dreamed. But it also painted a giant target on their back. Because at the end of the day, Adobe doesn't just rent you software, they rent you your own creativity. And the question the future will answer is simple. How long will people keep paying before someone offers them a cheaper, freer way to create? And about time too, if you ask me. Right. Well, there you have it. Two blokes in a garage figured out how to turn ownership into rental and convinced the entire world to thank them for it. The subscription economy ruining your monthly budget isn't innovation, it's extraction, and Adobe wrote the bloody manual. You'll want to stick around for more stories of companies that'll have you wondering how they convinced us all to pay more for owning less. Bah, humbug.